Keanu Reeves walked into the grand lobby of the luxurious hotel, his steps steady, yet his presence unnoticed by most. It was the kind of place where wealth and status were worn like badges, where people like him blended in without drawing attention. His dark, modest clothing didn't scream success. It whispered of a man who preferred to stay behind the scenes. He wasn't here for the extravagant surroundings or the golden chandeliers. He had a simple task: check in. But the receptionist, a young woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, was in no mood for simple. As Keanu approached the counter, he noticed her eyes glance up briefly before darting back to the screen in front of her. There was a fleeting moment where their gazes met, but it didn't last. "Can I help you?" she asked, not even bothering to disguise the annoyance in her voice. Keanu, with his soft-spoken demeanor, gave her a polite smile. "Yes, I have a reservation." The receptionist didn't immediately acknowledge his words. She clicked her nails against the counter as if impatient with the interaction, scanning the list in front of her. "Name?" she asked, barely looking up. "Reeves," he replied. She paused for a moment, her fingers still on the keyboard, then shot him a look, as if she had been expecting someone more fitting for the hotel. "Mr. Reeves, we seem to have a situation here." Her tone was sarcastic, almost mocking. "You're listed as staying in one of our top suites, but you don't seem the type to afford it." Keanu didn't flinch. He had faced far worse in his life: judgments, misconceptions, and the inevitable condescension that came from wealthier circles. But something about the way she spoke, with such certainty, was different. The way she looked at him made it feel as though she was making an example out of him. He stood there quietly, allowing her to finish her assessments. She continued typing, her fingers now moving faster, almost as if eager to get rid of him. "I'll just need a card for incidentals. Or do you prefer to pay in cash?" she asked, her lips curling slightly as if she'd already decided he couldn't possibly afford the room. Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out a sleek, unassuming card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. It wasn't flashy, nothing about it screamed wealth, but it was the kind of card that meant business. Her expression faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered, swiping the card without looking at him. "I suppose that's fine," she muttered, the sarcasm still hanging in the air. As Keanu took the keycard from her, her eyes followed him with a look of silent judgment. But just before he turned to leave, something caught her attention on her screen. The name, Reeves, triggered a new set of information, his profile from a database she hadn't been trained to access. There, under the hotel's records, was an important note she had missed. The man standing in front of her, the man she had just humiliated, was not just any ordinary guest. He wasn't just staying in one of their top suites, he owned the entire building. Her breath caught in her throat as she quickly scanned the screen again. Keanu was the founder and owner of the hotel chain, the one whose name was revered in the business world for his discreet, yet revolutionary approach to the luxury industry. It was a name that those in the upper echelons of society would recognize instantly, but it was one she had never connected to the unassuming man standing before her. Suddenly, the room felt smaller. The weight of her earlier words, her judgments, crushed her with a sense of shame. Keanu turned to leave, his movements calm and graceful, as if he hadn't heard her silent apology. He glanced over his shoulder, catching her panicked expression for just a moment. "Next time, be careful with your assumptions," he said quietly, his voice holding no malice, just a quiet truth. As he walked away, the receptionist stood frozen, the reality of her mistake sinking in. She had just humiliated a man who could end her career with a single phone call, and yet, he hadn't said a word. She could only watch as Keanu disappeared into the elevator, the echo of his departure louder than the judgment she had passed upon him. The story wasn't over, not for her. The next day, the receptionist found herself alone at her desk, a deep sense of unease hanging over her. The hotel lobby was quieter than usual, the usual hum of wealthy patrons coming and going replaced with an eerie stillness. She couldn't stop thinking about Keanu Reeves. The encounter had replayed in her mind 1,000 times, each time a wave of embarrassment washing over her. She had been rude, dismissive, and worst of all, completely wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted when a manager, Mr. Collins, approached her desk. He was tall, with a reputation for being strict, but he was also known for being one of the most well-connected men in the industry. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face for something. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice more concerned than usual. The receptionist nodded quickly, trying to mask her discomfort. "Yes, sir, everything's fine, Mr." Collins studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "You're sure? I heard there was some issue yesterday. A guest was treated poorly." Care to explain? Her heart sank. She knew this was coming. The report from the front desk had already made its way up to him, and now she had to face the consequences. She tried to hold herself together. "I didn't know who he was, sir. He didn't look like someone who could afford, well, the room. And I wasn't thinking." "Mr." Collins crossed his arms, his face hardening. "Do you have any idea who that guest was?" She shook her head. "No, sir, I don't." He let out a deep sigh. "His name is Keanu Reeves. He owns the hotel chain, and that suite you dismissed him from. It's one of his properties." Her stomach dropped. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had just insulted the owner of the very hotel she worked at. Not only had she made a fool of herself, but now she was facing potential fallout that could cost her everything. She was terrified, but there was something else too: embarrassment, guilt, and a deep sense of shame. "Mr. Collins," seeing the panic in her eyes, softened a little. "You're lucky he's a man of grace. He could have taken serious action. Instead, he chose to walk away, let it go. But you owe him an apology, and you better make sure it's sincere." The receptionist nodded, barely able to speak. She had no idea what she was going to do. How could she possibly make up for such a huge mistake? She didn't even deserve his forgiveness. That evening, after her shift, she walked into the hotel's lobby again, this time with a sense of dread weighing on her. The lobby, which had seemed so grand and impressive before, now felt cold, almost suffocating. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she had overheard earlier, about the power Keanu had, the quiet authority he carried with him. How he could have easily crushed her, but he hadn't. She saw him again as he entered the lobby, this time with a briefcase in hand, his movements still calm and collected. She knew it was now or never. Taking a deep breath, she approached him, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Reeves," she began, her voice small but sincere. "I owe you an apology. What I said yesterday, the way I treated you, it was wrong. I misjudged you, and I am truly sorry." Keanu stopped, walking and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was no anger, no harshness in his eyes. He simply looked at her, as if waiting for something more. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment," she continued. "I didn't know who you were, and I treated you poorly. You didn't deserve that." Keanu regarded her for a moment before speaking, his voice calm, but with a certain depth to it. "It's easy to make assumptions when we're only looking at the surface. But the truth is, we're all human. And sometimes, we forget that." Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected anger, maybe even resentment, but instead, he was showing understanding. "I hope you learn from this," he added, his gaze unwavering. "Don't let anyone else's appearance define their worth. And don't make the mistake of assuming you know who someone is just by what they show on the outside." His words were simple, but they hit her harder than anything else could. It wasn't just about the mistake she had made with him. It was about how people judge others based on their status, their wealth, or their looks. It was a painful lesson, but one that she would never forget. Keanu turned to leave, but not before offering a final, quiet piece of advice: be kinder next time. It might change everything for someone else. As he walked away, the receptionist felt a shift in her own perspective. Maybe she had learned something far greater than she had anticipated from this encounter. The realization hung in the air like a weight lifting from her shoulders. This was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And somewhere, in the back of her mind, she knew that this story wasn't over. Not for her, not for Keanu. The next few days felt different for the receptionist. She moved through her shifts with a new awareness, a quiet humility that hadn't been there before. Her interactions with guests were more thoughtful, her words more measured. Yet, the nagging feeling that she still had something to prove never quite left. The encounter with Keanu had made her reevaluate not only her behavior but also her life choices. She had never imagined how such a simple, yet profound, moment could change everything for her. One morning, as she was finishing her shift, Mr. Collins approached her again, this time with a serious look on his face. He handed her a folder, a subtle hint that something important was inside. "I need you to meet with the higher-ups today. They want to discuss your conduct, and not in the way you might think." Her stomach dropped. She thought for sure this was it. The apology had not been enough, and now her job was on the line. But as she stepped into the conference room, her thoughts began to shift. The room was filled with a few familiar faces, people she had seen around but never interacted with. And then, seated at the head of the table, was Keanu Reeves. She froze for a moment, her heart racing. Keanu didn't look like he had any intention of letting her off the hook for the humiliation, but there was something different in his demeanor now, something that made her nervous yet curious. Keanu motioned for her to sit down. "Please, take a seat," he said with the same calm and composed tone she had heard before. There was no malice in his voice, only a quiet presence that filled the room. Mr. Collins took a step forward. "We've been discussing your actions, and while the incident you caused could have led to serious consequences, there's something we all agree on. We believe people can change." His gaze shifted to Keanu, who nodded in agreement. "That's why we're giving you an opportunity," Keanu spoke, his voice steady. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do after. You've apologized, and from what I can tell, you're trying to grow from it. So, instead of disciplinary action, we're offering you a chance to work on a new project. We want to see how you handle responsibility." The receptionist's mind raced, her confusion mingling with a sense of relief. "A project? What kind of project?" she asked, her voice unsure. "We're launching a new initiative," Keanu explained. "It's designed to help those who've fallen on hard times, people in need of second chances. You'll be overseeing the coordination of this project. It's a way for us to give back, but it's also a test. We'll see how you handle the pressure, the logistics, and the relationships." Her heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She had expected to be reprimanded, maybe even let go. But instead, she was being given a chance to prove herself, not just to her bosses, but to herself. "But why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, and sometimes, the people who make the biggest mistakes end up learning the most valuable lessons. You've shown me that you're willing to grow. Now, we'll see what you do with the opportunity." As the meeting continued, the receptionist could hardly process the weight of what was being asked of her. She had just been handed an opportunity to make a real difference, not only in the lives of others but in her own. The irony of it wasn't lost on her. Just days ago, she had humiliated the very man who now believed in her potential to make things right. Keanu, once again, had demonstrated something that had been missing in her life, the power of forgiveness. But not just forgiveness. He had offered her the chance to be part of something bigger than herself, something that could change lives. She couldn't believe it. She hadn't expected this kind of redemption, and certainly not from someone she had wrongly judged. As she left the conference room, her mind was whirling. She felt a sense of determination rise within her. This project wasn't just a chance to prove herself, it was a chance to do something meaningful. And it was all because someone had shown her kindness when she least deserved it. Weeks went by as she threw herself into the project. She worked tirelessly, meeting with local organizations, helping to coordinate events for those in need. Slowly, her confidence grew. Keanu's belief in her, though unexpected, had inspired something deep within her. She wasn't the same person who had judged him so harshly. She wasn't even the same person who had walked into the lobby that day. But what struck her the most was how much of a difference this project was making in the community. She saw firsthand the impact of the hotel's initiative, how lives were being changed, and how people who had felt invisible were suddenly seen. And she realized something even more important. It wasn't just about what she had learned from Keanu. It was about what she could now give to others, what she could do to make the world a better place. One evening, as the project was nearing completion, Keanu walked into the hotel once again, his presence unmistakable. She looked up from her desk, her heart racing, knowing that this time, she was no longer the same person who had once embarrassed herself in front of him. He approached her, a faint smile on his lips. "How's the project going?" he asked, his tone casual but filled with genuine interest. She smiled back, the warmth in her voice reflecting the changes in her heart. "It's going well, really well, thank you, Mr. Reeves. I couldn't have done it without you." Keanu nodded, his expression softening. "No, you did it. I just gave you the chance. And it seems like you've taken it." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of shame or regret. Instead, she felt a deep sense of pride in herself, in the journey she had undertaken. It was a journey she knew she wouldn't have completed without the kindness of one man who had changed everything for her.